They all betrayed me. Now it's my turn.
The cardboard box in my hands felt heavier than it should have, considering it contained everything I owned after 15 years of marriage. Sarah stood in the doorway of what used to be our bedroom, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the frame as she watched me pack the last remnants of my life into a U-Haul truck parked in her driveway. "Don't forget to leave the garage door opener," she said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of condescension I'd grown to despise. "Richard will need it when he moves his Porsche in next week." Richard, her new husband. The real estate mogul with the perfect teeth and the bank account that made my engineering salary look like lunch money. I'd met him exactly once, at the divorce mediation, where he sat beside Sarah like a smug peacock, checking his Rolex every 5 minutes as if my financial ruin was keeping him from something more important. "Sure thing, sweetheart," I muttered, tossing the opener onto the kitchen counter with more force than necessary. "Wouldn't want to inconvenience Prince Charming." Sarah's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You know, David, this bitter act that doesn't suit you. The kids are watching." I glanced toward the living room where Emma and Jake sat on the couch, their eyes glued to their phones, pretending not to hear their parents' final exchange. Emma, 14 and already showing signs of her mother's calculating nature, hadn't looked at me directly in weeks. Jake, only 10, still gave me hesitant hugs goodbye, but I could see the confusion in his eyes every time Sarah whispered something in his ear about Daddy's new apartment and why Mommy had to find someone who could take better care of us. "Right," I said, grabbing my keys from the hook by the door. "Tell them I'll pick them up Friday at 6 for dinner." "Actually, about that," Sarah's voice took on that fake sweet tone that always preceded bad news. "Richard's taking us to the Hamptons this weekend. Family bonding time. Maybe we can reschedule for next week." Family bonding time. With her new family. The one that didn't include their actual father. I wanted to argue, to demand my court-ordered visitation. To remind her that those kids were half mine, regardless of who was paying for their private school tuition now. Instead, I nodded and walked out the front door, because fighting with Sarah in front of the kids had become a losing battle months ago. The drive to my childhood home on Long Island took 45 minutes through traffic that seemed designed to give me plenty of time to contemplate my spectacular fall from middle-class respectability. The house looked smaller than I remembered, its blue siding faded and the front steps sagging slightly, under the weight of 30 years and my mother's declining interest in maintenance since Dad died. Mom had moved to Florida 6 months ago, leaving me the keys and a vague promise to figure out what to do with the place eventually. For now, it was mine by default, a 40-year-old man moving back into his childhood bedroom like some kind of divorced cliché. I spent the first hour carrying boxes up to what used to be my room, now serving as Mom's storage space for everything she couldn't fit in her Tampa condo. The second hour was devoted to clearing enough space to set up an air mattress and a folding table for my laptop. By the third hour, I was standing in the middle of the cluttered room, surrounded by the detritus of my family's history, wondering how exactly my life had gotten so thoroughly derailed. That's when I noticed the briefcase. It was tucked behind a stack of my father's old engineering textbooks, partially hidden by a moth-eaten blanket that had covered my bed throughout high school. The leather was cracked and faded, but I recognized it immediately. It had belonged to my grandfather, Thomas Mitchell, the man who'd raised me after my parents' bitter divorce when I was 12. Grandpa Tom had been a force of nature, a self-made businessman who'd built Mitchell Construction from nothing into one of the most successful contracting companies on Long Island. He died when I was in college, and I'd always assumed his business had been sold off to pay for his medical bills and funeral expenses. Mom had been vague about the details, claiming the paperwork was too complicated and nothing you need to worry about, honey. The briefcase was locked, but I remembered Grandpa Tom's habit of hiding spare keys in obvious places. Sure enough, I found a small brass key taped to the bottom of the case, exactly where a man who trusted his family would put it. Inside, I found documents that made my hands shake as I read them. The first was Grandpa Tom's will, dated 3 months before his death, leaving the entirety of Mitchell Construction, including its assets, properties, and a substantial trust fund, to my beloved grandson, David Mitchell, to be administered by the family until his 35th birthday, at which time full control shall transfer to him absolutely. I'd turned 38 last month. The second document was a letter in my grandfather's handwriting, addressed to me personally. David, if you're reading this, it means the family has kept you in the dark about your inheritance, probably because they've been living off it while you struggled. I'm not surprised. Your mother always resented that I chose you as my heir instead of her. And your Uncle Frank never forgave me for not making him a partner. By now, they've probably convinced you that the business was worthless and had to be sold. Don't believe them. Mitchell Construction is worth $8 million, and every penny of it belongs to you. The company has been managed by Hartwell and Associates since my death, and they'll have all the records you need. Don't let the family steal what's yours, son. You're stronger than they think you are. I read the letter 3 times before the implications fully sank in. While I'd been struggling to pay child support and living in a studio apartment in Queens, while Sarah had been lecturing me about financial responsibility and providing for our children, while I'd been working 60-hour weeks just to keep my head above water, my own family had been sitting on a fortune that legally belonged to me. The third document was a business card for Hartwell and Associates with a handwritten note on the back. Ask for Margaret Hartwell. Tell her Tom Mitchell's grandson is ready to claim his inheritance. I sat on the floor of my childhood bedroom, surrounded by boxes and memories, and felt something shift inside my chest. It wasn't relief or joy or even anger exactly. It was something colder and more focused. Something that felt like the beginning of a plan. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Forgot to mention, Richard's lawyer wants to discuss modifying the custody arrangement. Something about stability and the children's best interests. We'll call you next week. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Let them wait. Let them wonder. Let them keep assuming that David Mitchell was the same pushover who'd rolled over during the divorce proceedings, who'd accepted a settlement that left him with nothing while his ex-wife moved into a penthouse with her new husband. Tomorrow, I'd call Margaret Hartwell. Tomorrow, I'd find out exactly how much my family had stolen from me. Tomorrow, I'd start taking back everything that should have been mine all along. But tonight, I sat in the gathering darkness of my childhood room and smiled for the first time in months. Margaret Hartwell's office occupied the top floor of a glass tower in downtown Manhattan, the kind of place where the receptionist's handbag probably cost more than my monthly rent. I'd called first thing in the morning, and she'd agreed to see me immediately, which should have been my first clue that this meeting was going to change everything. She was younger than I'd expected, and maybe 45, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of sharp, intelligent eyes that probably saw through corporate BS from 3 miles away. Her handshake was firm, professional, and she gestured me toward a leather chair that faced floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the city. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, settling behind her desk with a thick manila folder. "I've been waiting for this call for 3 years." 3 years? That's when you turned 35 and should have taken control of your inheritance. She opened the folder and pulled out a document that looked official and expensive. "I sent multiple letters to your last known address, but they were all returned as undeliverable. I tried calling, but the number I had was disconnected." I thought about the apartment Sarah and I had shared in Queens, the one we'd moved out of when Emma started middle school and Sarah decided we needed to be in a better school district. The one where I'd never bothered to file a change of address, because I'd assumed any important mail would find its way to me eventually. "I never got any letters," I said. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "I see. Well, you're here now, and that's what matters. Let me bring you up to speed on your grandfather's estate." She spread several documents across the desk, each one making my head spin a little more. Financial statements, property deeds, business valuations, bank account summaries. The numbers were staggering. "Mitchell Construction was sold 18 months after your grandfather's death," Margaret explained. "The sale price was $12.3 million. After taxes and fees, the trust was left with approximately $9.8 million, which has been invested conservatively as per your grandfather's instructions." My mouth felt dry. $9.8 million. That was 3 years ago. The current value of the trust is approximately $14.2 million. She slid a bank statement across the desk. "This doesn't include the real estate holdings, which are substantial." I stared at the numbers on the page, trying to process what she was telling me. $14 million, plus real estate. While I'd been eating ramen noodles and shopping at thrift stores, I had been worth more money than I could have imagined. "Who's been managing all this?" I asked. "The trust was administered by the executors your grandfather named in his will. Your mother, Patricia Mitchell Torres, and your uncle, Frank Mitchell. They've been receiving detailed quarterly reports and have had full access to the trust documents." My mother and uncle. The same people who'd spent the last 3 years telling me how sorry they were about my financial difficulties and my unfortunate divorce. The same people who'd listened to me complain about child support payments and never once mentioned that I was sitting on a fortune. They knew, I said, more to myself than to Margaret. They've known this whole time. Mr. Mitchell, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Margaret leaned forward, her voice taking on a more serious tone. Have you signed any documents in the past 3 years? Anything related to your grandfather's estate or any financial agreements involving your family members? I thought back through the blur of divorce proceedings, custody arrangements, and the general chaos of my life falling apart. I don't think so. Why? Because according to my records, someone has been making withdrawals from the trust. Small amounts, relatively speaking, but consistent. About $50,000 every 6 months for the past 2 years. The room seemed to tilt slightly. What kind of withdrawals? Administrative fees, supposedly. Payments to a consulting company called Torres Financial Services for estate management and beneficiary coordination. Margaret's voice was carefully neutral, but I caught the implication. Torres. My mother's married name. My mother has been stealing from me. That's a strong word, Mr. Mitchell. The withdrawals were technically legal under the terms of the trust, which allows for reasonable administrative expenses. However, I've been unable to determine what services Torres Financial Services has actually provided to justify these payments. I sat back in the leather chair, trying to absorb the magnitude of what I was learning. My family hadn't just hidden my inheritance from me. They'd been actively profiting from it while watching me struggle. While Sarah had been lecturing me about financial responsibility while I'd been working overtime to afford Emma's school supplies and Jake's soccer cleats, my own mother had been siphoning money from an account that should have made all of those worries irrelevant. What do I need to do to take control of the trust? I asked. Margaret smiled, and for the first time since I'd entered her office, she looked genuinely pleased. Nothing complicated. You sign some paperwork, I transfer the accounts into your name, and you become a very wealthy man. The process should take about a week. And the money my mother took? That's more complicated. If you can prove that Torres Financial Services didn't provide legitimate services to the trust, you might have grounds for recovery, but that would likely require legal action against your family members. I thought about my mother in her Florida condo, probably sitting by the pool right now, drinking wine that I'd unknowingly paid for. I thought about Uncle Frank, who'd always treated me like a disappointment, who'd made pointed comments about young people these days not understanding the value of hard work. I thought about all the times they'd offered me their sympathy for my financial struggles while secretly living off money that belonged to me. I want to pursue it, I said. Are you sure? Family litigation can get very ugly, very quickly. I'm sure. Margaret nodded and made a note in the file. There's something else you should know. The real estate holdings include a property that might interest you. Your grandfather owned a penthouse apartment in Manhattan. It's been sitting empty since his death, but it's fully paid for and worth approximately $3.2 million in today's market. A penthouse in Manhattan. While I'd been living in a studio apartment with a broken air conditioner and a neighbor who practiced violin at 3 in the morning. Can I see it? Of course. I have the keys right here. An hour later, I was standing in the marble foyer of a penthouse that took up the entire top floor of a pre-war building on the Upper East Side. The apartment was massive. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a kitchen that belonged in a magazine, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Central Park. The furniture was covered with dust sheets, and the air smelled stale from years of disuse, but the bones of the place were spectacular. This was the kind of apartment that Sarah had dreamed about, the kind of place she'd pointed out in real estate magazines while complaining about our cramped 3-bedroom house in Queens. I walked through the room slowly, running my fingers along marble countertops and hardwood floors that probably cost more than most people's cars. In the master bedroom, I found a framed photograph on the nightstand, my grandfather and grandmother at their wedding, both of them young and smiling, full of hope for the future they were building together. My phone buzzed with another text from Sarah. Richard's lawyer called. They want to meet Thursday to discuss the custody modification. Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. I stared at the message for a long moment, then walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the park. Somewhere out there, Sarah was probably having lunch with her friends, complaining about her irresponsible ex-husband and how grateful she was to have found a man who could provide stability for her children. Our children. The ones she was trying to take away from me because I couldn't afford to compete with Richard's wealth. I typed back, "Actually, I think we need to talk, all of us. I have some news that might change things." Her response came back immediately. "What kind of news?" I smiled and put the phone away without answering. Let her wonder, let her worry, let her spend the next few days trying to figure out what her loser ex-husband could possibly have to say that would matter to anyone. By Thursday, I'd have the paperwork signed and the accounts transferred. By Thursday, I'd be worth more money than Richard had probably ever seen in one place. By Thursday, I'd be ready to have a very different kind of conversation about custody arrangements and the children's best interests. I walked back through the penthouse, making mental notes about what needed to be cleaned and updated, already planning how I'd furnish the place. The kids would love it here. Emma could have her own bathroom, and Jake would go crazy for the view of the park. Sarah had been right about one thing. The children did deserve stability. They deserved a father who could provide for them, who could give them opportunities, who could show them that hard work and patience eventually paid off. They just hadn't realized which parent was going to be able to provide those things. The custody meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 2 o'clock in Richard's lawyer's office, a sterile conference room in Midtown with a view of nothing but other office buildings. I arrived 15 minutes early carrying a leather briefcase that had belonged to my grandfather and wearing the only suit I owned, a charcoal gray number I'd bought for job interviews during the divorce. Sarah was already there when I walked in, sitting beside Richard at the polished conference table, both of them looking like they'd stepped out of a luxury car commercial. Richard's lawyer, a thin man with expensive glasses and the kind of smile that probably charged by the hour, stood up to shake my hand. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm James Crawford. Thank you for coming in today." "Thanks for arranging this," I said, settling into the chair across from Sarah and Richard. "I think we're going to have a very productive conversation." Sarah was studying me with a puzzled expression, probably trying to figure out why I seemed so calm. During our divorce proceedings, these kinds of meetings had typically involved me getting defensive and angry while her lawyer systematically dismantled my arguments. Today, I just smiled and waited for Crawford to begin his presentation. "As I explained to your attorney," Crawford said, opening a file folder, "my clients are concerned about the stability of the current custody arrangement. Mr. Torres has graciously offered to provide additional support for Emma and Jake's educational and extracurricular expenses, but only if we can establish a more structured visitation schedule that takes into account the children's evolving needs." Richard leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the tone of a man accustomed to getting his way through reasonable-sounding ultimatums. "David, I want you to know this isn't personal. I think you're a good father, but let's be realistic about the situation. Sarah and I can provide opportunities for Emma and Jake that you simply can't match on an engineer's salary." "What kind of opportunities?" I asked. "Private tutoring, summer programs, college preparation courses," Sarah said, ticking off items on her fingers. "Emma wants to apply to prep schools for high school, and Jake is showing real talent in soccer. These things require resources, David. Resources that Richard can provide. And in exchange for these resources, you want to reduce my visitation time. We want to create a schedule that makes sense for everyone," Crawford interjected. "Perhaps every other weekend, with some holiday arrangements. It would give you more time to focus on your career advancement, and it would provide the children with consistency in their primary residence." I nodded thoughtfully as if I were actually considering their proposal. "That's very generous of Richard. Very thoughtful. I can see why you'd want to formalize this arrangement." Sarah looked surprised by my reasonable tone. "So you're open to discussing modifications?" "Oh, absolutely. In fact, I have a counterproposal that I think addresses everyone's concerns about resources and opportunities." I opened my briefcase and pulled out a folder containing bank statements, property deeds, and a letter from Margaret Hartwell, confirming the transfer of my grandfather's trust. I spread the documents across the conference table like a poker player revealing a royal flush. "What's all this?" Crawford asked, leaning forward to examine the papers. "Well, it turns out there's been a misunderstanding about my financial situation," I said, enjoying the way Sarah's face was slowly changing color as she read the bank statements. "See, my grandfather left me a rather substantial inheritance that I only learned about this week. $14.2 million to be exact, plus some real estate holdings, including a penthouse on the Upper East Side. The silence in the room was absolute. Richard was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. 14 million? Give or take. The markets fluctuate, you understand. I turned to Sarah, who was staring at the documents like they might disappear if she blinked. So I think we can put the resource question to rest, don't you? Emma's prep school applications, Jake's soccer programs, college funds. I can handle all of that without breaking a sweat. Crawford was frantically scanning the legal documents, probably trying to figure out if they were legitimate. Mr. Mitchell, these papers indicate that this trust has been in existence for several years. Why are you only claiming it now? That's an excellent question, I said, my voice taking on a harder edge. It seems my family forgot to mention my inheritance. For 3 years, they've been administering the trust while I struggled to pay child support and lived in a studio apartment. Funny how these things slip people's minds. Sarah finally found her voice. David, I had no idea. Of course you didn't. How could you? Although it is interesting timing, isn't it? You filed for divorce right around the time I should have been notified about the inheritance. But I'm sure that's just a coincidence. The color drained from Sarah's face. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. I pulled out another document, a timeline that Margaret Hartwell had helped me prepare. My 35th birthday was 3 years ago. That's when the trust should have transferred to my control. The letters notifying me were sent to our old address in Queens, the one we moved out of 6 months before my birthday. The same time you started talking about needing a better neighborhood for the kids. Richard was looking back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match. Sarah, did you know about this inheritance? Of course not. But her voice was too high, too defensive. Really? Because I had an interesting conversation with my mother yesterday. After I confronted her about the money she's been stealing from my trust, she had some very illuminating things to say about family loyalty and keeping secrets. I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the way Sarah's hands were starting to shake. Apparently, you two had several long conversations during our marriage about my lack of ambition and my failure to live up to my family's expectations. She felt so sorry for you, stuck with a husband who couldn't provide the lifestyle you deserved. I never asked her to. You never asked her to hide my inheritance? You never suggested that maybe I wasn't mature enough to handle that kind of responsibility? You never agreed that it would be better for everyone if I just kept working my regular job and living within my modest means? Crawford was frantically taking notes, probably realizing that his client's position had just collapsed entirely. Richard was staring at Sarah with an expression I recognized, the look of a man who was beginning to understand that he'd been played. Sarah, Richard said quietly, did you know about David's inheritance when you married me? It's complicated. It's actually very simple, I said. My wife conspired with my family to hide my inheritance so she could divorce me, claim I was financially irresponsible, and take custody of our children. Then she married you for your money, probably figuring that was her best shot at the lifestyle she wanted. The only problem is, she bet on the wrong horse. Sarah was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks in dark streaks. David, please, you have to understand. I understand perfectly. You wanted a rich husband, and you were willing to destroy our family to get one. The only thing you didn't count on was me actually becoming rich. I started gathering up my documents, sliding them back into the briefcase. So here's my counter-proposal, Crawford. I want full custody of Emma and Jake. Sarah can have supervised visitation every other weekend, assuming she can afford the legal fees to fight me on this. Now wait just a minute, Crawford said, his professional composure finally cracking. You can't just waltz in here and I can do whatever I want. I have $14 million and the best lawyers money can buy. More importantly, I have documentation proving that my ex-wife deliberately concealed assets during our divorce proceedings, which makes our entire settlement agreement null and void. I stood up, straightening my tie. I'll be filing for emergency custody modification tomorrow morning. I suggest you advise your clients to prepare for a very expensive legal battle. Richard was still staring at Sarah like he'd never seen her before. You knew. All this time, you knew he was supposed to inherit millions. And you let me believe he was just some deadbeat who couldn't support his kids. Richard, I can explain. No, I don't think you can. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I think I need to have a conversation with my own lawyer about prenuptial agreements and marriage fraud. Sarah's sobs were getting louder, but I felt nothing but cold satisfaction as I watched her perfect world crumble around her. This was what she deserved for trying to steal my children. This was what she got for betting that David Mitchell would stay down after she knocked him to the ground. One more thing, I said, pausing at the conference room door. Sarah, you might want to call your mother-in-law in Florida. I had a very interesting conversation with the IRS yesterday about an unreported income from Torres Financial Services. Apparently, they're going to want to discuss those consulting fees she's been collecting from my trust. I walked out of the office and took the elevator down to street level, leaving behind the sound of Sarah's crying and Richard's angry questions. On the sidewalk outside, I pulled out my phone and called Margaret Hartwell. "It's done," I said when she answered. "I think we're going to need those custody lawyers you recommended. How did they take the news?" I smiled, watching the traffic flow past on the busy street, about as well as you'd expect. I think Sarah's going to have a very difficult conversation with her new husband tonight. "And you're sure you want to pursue full custody? It's going to be a battle. I've been fighting for my children for 3 years while everyone around me conspired to keep me powerless. Now I have the resources to win." I started walking toward the subway station, feeling lighter than I had in months. Let's show them what happens when you try to steal from a Mitchell. The emergency custody hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, which gave me exactly 5 days to prepare for the most important legal battle of my life. I spent those days moving into the penthouse, hiring the best family law attorney in New York, and having several very uncomfortable conversations with family members who were suddenly eager to work things out now that I controlled the purse strings. My mother called on Saturday morning, her voice shaking as she tried to explain why she'd hidden my inheritance for 3 years. "David, honey, you have to understand. We were trying to protect you. You were so young when your grandfather died, and then with the divorce and everything, we thought it would be better to wait until you were more stable." I was 35, Mom. I had 2 kids and a mortgage. How much more stable did I need to be? Your grandfather's money came with so much responsibility. The business decisions, the investments, the pressure. We saw what it did to him, how it consumed his life. We wanted you to have a chance to be happy without all that weight on your shoulders. I was standing in my new kitchen, looking out at Central Park while my mother spun lies that might have sounded reasonable if I hadn't seen the bank records showing her systematic theft from my trust. "So you decided to steal from me instead?" "We didn't steal anything. Those were legitimate administrative fees for a consulting company that exists only on paper." "Mom, I've seen the records. Torres Financial Services has no employees, no office, no business license. It's just a bank account you set up to siphon money from my inheritance." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. "David," she finally said, her voice smaller now, "I know how this looks, but you have to believe me. We never meant for it to go on this long. We were going to tell you everything once the divorce was finalized and you got back on your feet. When? When I turned 40, 50? When exactly were you planning to stop stealing from your own son? Don't talk to me like that. I'm still your mother." "No," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "You're a thief who happens to share my DNA. There's a difference." I hung up before she could respond and immediately called Margaret Hartwell to discuss the criminal charges I wanted to file against Torres Financial Services. Uncle Frank was next, showing up at my penthouse on Sunday afternoon with a bottle of expensive whiskey and a speech about family loyalty that might have been touching if it hadn't come 3 years too late. "David, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But we're family. We stick together. We work through our problems. We don't air our dirty laundry in court for everyone to see." He was sitting in my grandfather's favorite chair, looking around the penthouse with obvious envy. Frank had always resented that his father had chosen me over him as heir to the family business, and I could see him calculating the value of everything in the room. "We're family when it's convenient for you," I said. "When you need someone to steal from, when you need someone to lie to, when you need someone to feel superior to. But when I needed help during my divorce, when I was working 60-hour weeks just to pay child support, when I was living in a studio apartment and eating ramen noodles, where was the family loyalty then? You never asked for help. I shouldn't have had to ask. You knew I was struggling and you knew I had $14 million sitting in a trust account. You could have ended my financial problems with a phone call, but instead, you watched me suffer while you collected your consulting fees." Frank set down his whiskey glass and leaned forward, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I remembered from childhood. "You think money solves everything, don't you? You think because you've got your grandfather's fortune now, you can just write checks and make all your problems disappear. But money doesn't make you a better father, David. It doesn't undo the mistakes you made in your marriage. You're right. Money doesn't make me a better father, but it does give me the power to fight for my children instead of watching helplessly while my ex-wife tries to steal them from me. I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. And it gives me the resources to make sure that everyone who betrayed me faces the consequences of their choices. Frank left without finishing his whiskey, muttering something about ungrateful children and family values. I watched him go and felt nothing but relief that I'd finally seen my relatives for what they really were. The custody hearing itself was a masterpiece of legal theater. Sarah arrived with Richard, both of them looking like they'd aged 5 years in the past week. Her lawyer was different. Apparently, Crawford had decided that representing her was too much of a conflict of interest, given Richard's own legal problems. My attorney, Catherine Walsh, was everything I'd hoped for when Margaret Hartwell recommended her. She was sharp, ruthless, and had a reputation for destroying opponents who underestimated her. She'd spent the weekend preparing a presentation that laid out Sarah's deception in devastating detail. Your Honor, Walsh began, this case is about more than custody arrangements. It's about a pattern of fraud and manipulation that goes to the heart of my client's fitness as a parent and his ability to provide for his children. She presented the timeline of my inheritance, the hidden letters, the suspicious timing of Sarah's divorce filing, and the evidence of collusion between Sarah and my family members. She showed bank records, proving that I was now worth more than $15 million, making any concerns about financial stability irrelevant. But the most damaging evidence was a series of text messages between Sarah and my mother that Margaret Hartwell's investigators had uncovered during their examination of the trust administration. Walsh read them aloud in court. Patricia, you have to make sure David never finds out about the trust money. If he gets control of that inheritance, he'll fight me for custody, and he'll probably win. And the response, don't worry. As long as Frank and I control the trust, David will never know what he's missing. Just make sure the divorce goes through before his 35th birthday. Sarah was crying by the time Walsh finished reading the messages, but these weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of a woman who'd been caught and was facing the consequences. Her new lawyer tried to argue that my sudden wealth didn't change the children's established living situation, that Emma and Jake were happy in their current school district, that disrupting their routine would be traumatic. But it was a weak defense, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The judge, an older woman with steel gray hair and no patience for family drama, listened to both sides before delivering her ruling. Mr. Mitchell, I'm granting your petition for emergency modification of custody. The evidence presented today demonstrates that the original custody arrangement was based on fraudulent representations about your financial circumstances. Mrs. Torres, your actions in concealing your ex-husband's inheritance constitute a serious breach of your fiduciary duty as a co-parent. Sarah's sob echoed through the courtroom. Effective immediately, primary custody of Emma and Jake Mitchell will transfer to their father. Mrs. Torres, you'll have supervised visitation rights pending a full investigation into your conduct during the original divorce proceedings. I felt a rush of triumph that was almost overwhelming. After 3 years of being treated like a second-class parent, after countless nights lying awake, worrying about losing my children, I'd finally won. But the judge wasn't finished. Mr. Mitchell, I want to be clear about something. Your newfound wealth gives you resources, but it doesn't automatically make you a better parent. These children have been through enough disruption, and I expect you to prioritize their emotional well-being over any desire for revenge against your ex-wife. I understand, Your Honor. I hope you do, because I'll be monitoring this situation closely. And if I see any evidence that you're using your financial advantage to punish Mrs. Torres rather than to benefit your children, I won't hesitate to revisit this custody arrangement. After the hearing, I found Emma and Jake waiting in the hallway with a social worker. They looked scared and confused, caught between parents who'd been waging war over their futures without considering how the battle was affecting them. Emma, my serious 14-year-old, was the first to speak. Dad, is it true? Are we going to live with you now? If you want to, I said, kneeling down so I was at eye level with both of them. I know this is all very confusing, and I know there's been a lot of fighting between your mom and me, but I want you to know that none of this is your fault. And no matter what happens, both your parents love you very much. Jake, who'd been unusually quiet, suddenly threw his arms around my neck. I missed you, Daddy. I didn't like the new house. It was too big and it echoed when I talked. I hugged him back, feeling tears I hadn't expected. I missed you too, buddy, both of you, more than you know. Emma was still holding back, studying me with the kind of analytical expression that reminded me painfully of Sarah. Mom says you're rich now. She says that's why the judge changed the custody. I did inherit some money from your great-grandfather. But that's not why I wanted you to live with me. I wanted you to live with me because you're my children. And I love you, and I've been fighting for 3 years to be a real part of your lives. Are you going to buy us stuff? Jake asked with the kind of direct curiosity that only 10-year-olds could manage. I laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd had in weeks. Maybe some stuff. But mostly, I'm going to try to be the best dad I can be. And that means making sure you're happy and healthy and that you know how much you mean to me. Emma nodded slowly as if she were processing this information and trying to decide whether to trust me. Can we still see Mom? Of course, she's still your mother and she loves you. We're going to work out a schedule so you can spend time with both of us. It wasn't entirely true. Sarah's visitation rights were going to be severely limited until the investigation into her conduct was complete. But Emma and Jake didn't need to know all the details of their parents' legal battles. They needed stability, reassurance, and time to adjust to their new reality. As we walked out of the courthouse together, my children's hands in mine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just for revenge or vindication, but for the chance to build something better from the wreckage of my old life. Sarah was standing on the courthouse steps with Richard, both of them looking lost and defeated. When she saw us coming, she started toward the kids, but her lawyer caught her arm and whispered something in her ear. She stopped, tears streaming down her face, and just watched as I led Emma and Jake toward the car that would take them to their new home. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered 3 years of struggle, 3 years of being treated like a failure, 3 years of watching my children slip away from me, while everyone around me conspired to keep me powerless. Sarah had made her choices. Now she could live with the consequences. Moving Emma and Jake into the penthouse was like watching 2 kids discover they'd won the lottery. Jake spent the first hour running from room to room, his voice echoing off the high ceilings as he claimed the bedroom with the best view of Central Park. Emma was more reserved, but I caught her taking pictures of the marble bathroom that was bigger than her old bedroom. Dad, she said, standing in the doorway of what would be her new room, this place is insane. How much did Great-Grandpa leave you? Enough. I said, setting down a box of her books on the window seat. Enough to make sure you and Jake never have to worry about money, enough to pay for college, wherever you want to go, enough to give you opportunities I never had. But not enough to fix things with Mom. I stopped unpacking and looked at my daughter, struck again by how perceptive she was. At 14, Emma had already learned to see through the polite lies adults told to protect children from complicated truths. Some things can't be fixed with money, I said. Your mom and I have hurt each other in ways that are going to take a long time to heal, if they ever do, but that doesn't change how much we both love you and Jake. She's really upset. Richard moved out yesterday. I wasn't surprised. Richard had built his identity around being the successful provider, the man who could offer Sarah and her children a lifestyle that their biological father couldn't match. Learning that he'd been manipulated into that role, that Sarah had married him under false pretenses while hiding her ex-husband's wealth, had probably shattered his ego beyond repair. I'm sorry to hear that. I know you liked Richard. Emma shrugged with the kind of studied indifference that teenagers use to mask their real feelings. He was okay, but he always felt temporary, you know? Like he was trying too hard to be our dad, instead of just being himself. Over the next few weeks, we settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. I enrolled the kids in a private school 6 blocks from the penthouse, hired a housekeeper to help with the domestic details I'd never had to manage as a part-time father, and discovered that having unlimited resources made parenting infinitely easier in some ways and more complicated in others. Emma wanted to take riding lessons, so I found the best equestrian program in Manhattan. Jake expressed interest in coding, so I bought him a top-of-the-line computer and enrolled him in weekend programming classes. When Emma's friends came over for study sessions, I ordered catered meals from restaurants I'd never been able to afford. When Jake wanted to invite his soccer team for a sleepover, I transformed the living room into a campground complete with professional-grade sleeping bags and a projector for movie night. But the real satisfaction came from the smaller moments. Helping Jake with his math homework at the kitchen island, while Emma practiced violin in her room. Making pancakes on Saturday mornings, while both kids argued about what we should do with our weekend. tucking them into beds in their own rooms, in their own home, without having to worry about custody schedules or court orders. Sarah's supervised visitation sessions were awkward and painful for everyone involved. She'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. The social worker who monitored their meetings reported that the kids were polite but distant, as if they weren't sure how to relate to their mother now that the family dynamics had shifted so dramatically. "She keeps apologizing," Emma told me after one particularly difficult visit. "Not just to us, but to everyone. The social worker, the receptionist, even the security guard. It's like she's trying to apologize her way back into being our mom." "She is your mom," I reminded her. "That doesn't change just because she made some bad choices. But it's different now. She feels guilty all the time, and we feel guilty for living here with you, and everything is just weird." I understood what Emma meant. Sarah's betrayal had poisoned the relationships between all of us, creating a web of resentment and mistrust that couldn't be untangled with good intentions and family therapy. The kids loved their mother, but they also knew she'd tried to take them away from me based on lies about my ability to provide for them. That knowledge changed everything. The legal consequences of Sarah's actions were still unfolding. The investigation into our original divorce settlement had uncovered evidence that she'd concealed assets and made false statements about my financial prospects. Her marriage to Richard was falling apart under the weight of his realization that he'd been used as a pawn in her scheme to secure a wealthy lifestyle. My mother and Uncle Frank were facing their own reckonings. The IRS audit of Torres Financial Services had expanded into a full criminal investigation of tax evasion and fraud. Both of them had hired expensive lawyers and were trying to negotiate plea agreements that would keep them out of prison. But their legal bills were mounting faster than their ability to pay them. I felt no sympathy for any of them. They'd made their choices when they thought I was powerless to fight back. Now they could live with the consequences. The most surprising development was my relationship with Margaret Hartwell. What had started as a professional arrangement had evolved into something closer to friendship. She'd become my advisor not just on financial matters, but on the complex emotional landscape of sudden wealth and family betrayal. "You're handling this better than most people would," she told me during one of our weekly meetings. "A lot of men in your situation would have used their money as a tool, trying to destroy everyone who'd wronged them." I thought about it, I admitted. There were nights when I lay awake planning elaborate revenge schemes, ways to make them all pay for what they'd done to me. "What stopped you?" I thought about Emma and Jake, about the way they'd looked at me in the courthouse hallway, scared and confused and needing their father to be the stable, reliable parent they could count on. My kids, they've been through enough chaos. They needed me to be the adult, to focus on building something positive instead of tearing down the people who'd hurt us. "That's wisdom," Margaret said, "and it's going to serve you well in the long run." But even as I tried to focus on the future, the past kept intruding in unexpected ways. Sarah's lawyer called to discuss the possibility of reconciliation, suggesting that perhaps we could work out a more generous custody arrangement if I was willing to help with her mounting legal bills. I declined politely but firmly. Richard's attorney reached out to see if I'd be willing to testify in his divorce proceedings against Sarah, offering to share information about her financial deceptions in exchange for my cooperation. I declined that as well, seeing no benefit in getting dragged deeper into their marital drama. My mother made one last attempt at reconciliation, showing up at the penthouse unannounced with tears and apologies and a speech about family forgiveness that might have been moving if it hadn't come after she'd been caught stealing from me. "David, please, you have to understand, I never meant for things to go this far. I was trying to protect you, trying to give you a chance at a normal life. Your grandfather's money destroyed his relationships, consumed his life, turned him into someone who trusted no one. I didn't want that for you." She was standing in my living room, looking small and frail and older than I remembered. For a moment, I almost felt the familiar tug of guilt and obligation that had shaped our relationship for so many years. Then I thought about the bank statements showing her systematic theft, the text messages coordinating with Sarah to hide my inheritance, the 3 years of watching me struggle while she lived comfortably off money that belonged to me. "You didn't want to protect me, Mom. You wanted to control me. You wanted to keep me dependent and grateful and unaware of my options. The money didn't destroy Grandpa's relationships. People like you did, people who saw his wealth as something they were entitled to share. I'm your mother. You're a thief who happens to be related to me, and I want you to leave my home and never contact my children again." She left in tears, and I felt nothing but relief as the door closed behind her. 6 months after the custody hearing, I was sitting in Central Park with Emma and Jake, watching them feed ducks at the pond, while other families enjoyed the warm spring afternoon. Emma was telling me about her plans for high school, her excitement about the advanced placement courses she could take at her new school. Jake was explaining his latest coding project, a simple game he was designing for his computer class. They were happy. More than that, they were thriving in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with stability, security, and the knowledge that their father was finally in a position to fight for them. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at it, expecting another update from Margaret or a reminder about Emma's writing lesson. Instead, it was from Sarah. "Thank you for not destroying me completely. I know I don't deserve your mercy, but I'm grateful for it." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Sarah's gratitude was irrelevant to me now. I'd won everything I'd wanted: my children, my inheritance, my dignity, and my future. Her acknowledgement of my restraint was just another reminder that I held all the power in our relationship now. "Dad," Jake said, running back from the pond with breadcrumbs on his shirt, "can we get ice cream on the way home?" "Sure, buddy. Whatever you want." As we walked back toward the penthouse, Emma on one side and Jake on the other, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with victory. I'd taken back everything that belonged to me: my money, my children, my self-respect, and my future. The people who'd betrayed me were facing the consequences of their choices, but that was their problem now, not mine. I was David Mitchell, heir to the Mitchell fortune, father to 2 amazing children, and master of my own destiny. After years of being underestimated and manipulated, I'd finally claimed my rightful place in the world, and it felt absolutely perfect.